we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Hi and welcome to another edition of Public Interest. I'm Gabriela Patrama. We're so happy that you can join us today. With me is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome again. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program.
It's always good to be here. Thank you.
Sir, today I want us to talk a little bit about the elections petition, and we're going to go back a little bit into the general and regional elections of 2020. It has been a long process since December of 2018 with the no confidence motion. We've had quite a number of legal cases in the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, the Caribbean Court of Justice. We were the recent one was the dismissal of the elections petition in April last month, and so forth. So before we get into my first question, how would you describe that process from 2018 to present?
Well, to start with, the process started a little before the no confidence motion, but what happened is that on the 2nd of August 2020, the process came to an end, the legal and the constitutional end, with the declaration of the chairman of the Election Commission. I had committed myself and my party and the coalition to accept or to acknowledge the declaration whenever it was made, as long as it was made legitimately by the chairman of the Election Commission. So as of the 2nd of August, I felt it was my duty to acknowledge that that declaration had been made, and thereafter it was only a matter of recourse to the court to challenge the declaration, which I said on the 2nd of August that it would be challenged. But the process was very long, as between 2nd of March and 2nd of August, I think maybe 153 days. It has never happened before, but there were a lot of good lessons that we learned from that process, and as you know, the coalition embarked on 2 petitions. But what happened during that time is that we thoroughly exhausted the law, the Representation of the People Act, the Constitution of Guyana, and we felt that a lot more work has to be done. But as of the 2nd of August, we had hit a wall in constitutional or legal terms, and I felt obliged to obey the declaration, or I never conceded, but what I did. People are calling on me to concede. There's no part of the Constitution which requires me to concede. I simply acknowledged it, knowing very well that the declaration was based on information with which we did not concur. So it was, even within days of the 2nd of March election, people were calling on me to demit office. Others were calling on me to remain in office. But I was obliged to follow the law. And the law required me to acknowledge the declaration whenever it was made. And that is what I said throughout, although people doubted that I would do so. And when 2nd of August came, I did so.
And on that note, importantly, you said you acknowledged the declaration.
Yes.
Why was it important for you to do that?
It's the law. It's the law. I could not, as leader of my party, mislead my supporters or create a lawless situation in Guyana. The law required me to acknowledge the declaration, and I did so.
Sir, the declaration of the results of the general and regional elections were made only after, like you mentioned, several legal challenges to determine the validity of the no confidence motion in December of 2018. The validity of the reports of the chief elections officer, the validity of the recount process, and the constitutional expression more votes cast had ended in July 2020. What were the implications of the final declaration for the for the electoral process, given the diverse legal interpretations which emerged?
Many onlookers could be confused by that process. We obviously challenged the vote of Mr. Charandas Prasad in December 2018.
Yes.
It turned out we were right, but we were wrong. He was not properly seated in the National Assembly, and therefore, in our view, his vote was invalid.
Right.
But the ruling of the court was that the challenge did not come in the stipulated. It's a technical point. The challenge was not made within the stipulated period. But my cabinet lost 4 ministers who legally were not correctly seated, and they had to demit office. But the courts allowed that to go through. From the beginning of 2019, literally within weeks of the no confidence motion, I had met with the leader of the opposition and the chairman of the Election Commission, in fact the entire Election Commission, asking them to hold credible elections in as short a time as possible, and committing myself to providing all of the parliamentary assistance that the Commission required. Once the elections were held, and again, people must realize that I had to rely on the chairman of the Election Commission to advise me when elections could be held. I do not have authority to call elections. I think one political leader was telling people in a certain region, they must chase me out of the region because I'm illegal. I must demit office. I think on reflection, I think he realizes that that was wild talk, loose talk. I could not leave office. The government could not be, the country could not be run without a government, without a president. And I had to wait until the Election Commission said it was ready to conduct elections. I never received any indication until the 19th of September, when the chairman of the commission wrote me and said that elections could not be held before the end of February.
Okay.
And elections were held on the first Monday after the February holidays. So the whole period was attenuated, I would say, because of the delay in holding elections. But I think on reflection, even the diplomats would accept that the election could not be held in Guyana before the 2nd of March. I did not have authority, nobody had authority to hold elections until the Election Commission did so itself. Once the elections were held, another process started, because within 72 hours of the elections, the PPP, through the instrumentality of Riaz Alada, brought a motion before the High Court, and once it got to the High Court, the process was in the hands of the judicial system. And there were several rulings at the High Court, and as you know, within succeeding months, 4 citizens, 𝐏𝐿𝐮 David, Esther Bostwick, Singer Jones, brought David Bostwick, David Jones, and I think there was a fourth applicant, and those applications dragged the process out. They were legitimate applications seeking to answer questions affecting the electoral process. And in one case, for example, it was ruled that the recount which was being challenged was not in accordance with law. In fact, I received, my Attorney General at the time, Basil Williams, received a clear statement from the Chief Parliamentary Counsel stating that the recount was not in accord with the law.
Even though you supported it.
Huh?
Even though you supported it.
Well, I have to work with advice.
Right.
And I did not enter into an agreement with Jack. I couldn't. A president cannot agree with an opposition to instruct the committee. The commission is independent. So I could not instruct. I did not instruct. It's the commission which made the decision. And then when we came to the matter of order 60, there was a challenge. This was an important area of contention. And I think, win or lose, the process helped to enrich our knowledge of the electoral process. And at the end of the process, today where we are, there must be some changes. As you know, we went from High Court to Court of Appeal, from Court of Appeal to CCJ. And in the final analysis, it was the chairman of the commission who decided that on the course of action that she would take. Do not forget that the chief election officer has specific duties under the Representation of the People Act and under the Constitution. And he is required to advise the chairman, and he produced 4 reports based on instructions received from the chairman, direct instructions which were published in the press, and based on his knowledge of what took place on the ground. He had to determine the validity of the votes. Over and over again, during that period between 2nd of March and 2nd of August, we have to come to grips with the concept of validity. And I think Mr. Lowenfield acted correctly in insisting that only valid votes could be counted. And when the matter came to the Guyana Court of Appeal, the majority agreed, the majority of justices agreed that valid votes meant valid votes cast, or votes cast meant valid votes. I did not expect the Court of Appeal to say invalid votes could be counted as valid votes.
But that should be standard in any election process.
Well,
valid
as I
votes.
said, the elections, there's a saying, that nothing's settled till it's settled right. And this matter hasn't been settled right. And we need to go back to the laws, we need to go back to the processes, we need to go back to the methods of appointing and describing or prescribing duties for election officials. But I think the elections raise more questions than answers. It's not a simple contest between win and lose. Were the elections credible? And were the votes valid? And if you go back to August 2019, within a month of her appointment as chairman of the Election Commission, the House registration process was brought to an end. My coalition, my party, and the persons who supported us, and don't forget we won the support of nearly 218,000 voters, felt that the list of electors was bloated. But we explored mechanisms for removing or sanitizing the official list of electors, but we were prevented from continuing or completing the process of house-to-house registration. So right now, we still have a bloated list, and my coalition believes that that bloated list was a contributory factor in enabling persons who were not qualified as electors to cast their vote. So, as I said, the electoral process has revealed a lot of anomalies, which our lawyers and our politicians will have to sit down and work out. But we still, it's really a work in progress, and we still have to examine ways and means of assuring the Guyanese public that the elections are not only free and fair, but the validity of the votes and the credibility of the results are without doubt. And I think a lot of doubts still remain.
Sir, on that note, your government during the electoral process would have been calling for credible elections and for the valid votes to be counted, like you just listed, like you just said, sorry. After the declared results, you said to the nation that you would challenge the declaration through the courts with the elections petition. Why do you support the elections petition after so many rulings by the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and the Caribbean Court of Justice?
We produced a massive dossier, the coalition collectively produced a massive dossier. And in truth, that dossier was compiled or facilitated by the recount process. And we discovered there were numerous abuses in all of the regions. When the complaints were submitted to the Elections Commission, we were informed that the Election Commission, in more or less, I'm not quoting them directly, was not a tribunal, and it could not investigate those complaints. And if we had any complaints, we should take the complaints to the courts. So that is the reason why we had to have petitions, because once the declaration is given, and this happened on the 2nd of August, the Election Commission more or less washes hands of any complaints that we might have had.
Okay.
And we had to go by way of petition. So there'd be petition number 88 and petition number 99. As you know, both of them have been submitted to the courts, and we are waiting on the outcomes of our appeals.
Correct. Sir, on March 14, 2020, you would have agreed with the then leader of the opposition to have the CARICOM team supervise the recount process.
No,
Am I
no,
correct?
no, no. Before you finish the question, I will not accept that I agree with the leader of the opposition with anything.
Okay.
It would be unconstitutional. I cannot agree with him or any other party to give instructions to the Election Commission is an independent and autonomous agency. What I agreed is that there could be, or there should be, and what the Election Commission did was to try to implement a decision on its own, even though it was advised by a recommendation that I had made during the time of the visit of the Caribbean community heads of government.
Right.
But I did not enter into any agreement with Mr. 𝐏𝐿𝐜. In fact, the fact is that we both agreed to have the same thing done. That we hit a wall, and it was decided that the recount was necessary. And I can tell you that without that recount, the abuses will not have come to light. So we must bear in mind that on the 5th of March, the Riaz-Alada injunction prevented any declaration from being made. So we were really at the constitutional standstill within 72 hours of the actual election. Something had to be done. And I am convinced, I was convinced then, and I'm convinced now, that a recount would show that there were abuses and anomalies and irregularities. And this was done, and the Election Commission said it could not consider it. It had to go to the courts, but it's gone to the courts.
Okay. And during the recount process, the ACNO AFC observers would have exposed these anomalies, the abuses.
Would have they actually
They
exposed
actually exposed them. Also, I would have read in the media that the CARICOM team that was supervising, I'm subject to correction here, sir, would have only examined 18% of the ballot boxes.
That is not would have. They actually did.
They actually did.
They actually did examine 18%, which meant that 82% of the boxes were not examined. But the team made up of APNU AFC supporters and volunteers actually conducted a complete scrutiny of all of the ballot boxes, and that is how we arrived at the table of anomalies and abuses and irregularities. So, although I had no objection to the CARICOM heads of government recommendation, although I had no objection to the Election Commission embarking on the recount process, the first thing that came out of the Attorney General's chambers was that it was not legitimate. And that is why we went back to the courts. But we would not have known what we now know without that recount process. But it is incorrect to say that I had any agreement with Mr. 𝐏𝐿𝐜. My agreement was, if any at all, was with the Election Commission. Commission had the authority to proceed, or to think it could proceed, and when it attempted to proceed, we went to the courts, not in order to prevent what I had agreed to do, but it turned out the Chief Parliamentary Counsel said that it was in breach of the law. The whole election process, I think, needs to be examined in a holistic way. And just picking out what 𝐏𝐿 Jones or Eslin David or Eston Bostwick said or did, or what which report the Chief Elections Officer presented, these are not the whole story. In essence, were the votes valid, and did we have credible elections? And APNU AFC is stating categorically that many of the votes which were cast were not valid, that the Chief Elections Officer had the authority to prevent invalid votes from being counted, and I believe that our election petition was justified, and we will continue to fight for, it's clearly a case of every vote counts. Every vote counts, and we believe that, look, if you have a situation in a polling station in which there are 192 electors, and you get SOPs for 212, it means something. You can't simply expect the CEO to accept them. And this is the heart of the problem. Some are bound to be invalid. Do we have a mechanism for determining the invalidity of votes? And that is what, that was at the core of the coalition's campaign during the so-called crisis, that 153 days period. There was malpractice. Even the CARICOM recon team realized that there was malpractice, except that they said for the 18% of the boxes that they examined, that it was not sufficient. If they had done 100%, perhaps they would have come to a different conclusion. But let us move on. As I said, on the 2nd of August, we hit a wall. We need to move on from there.
But sir, why were there so many irregularities from the general and regional elections of 2020?
The irregularities arose out of, one, a bloated list in which there were perhaps near to 200,000 persons who
were not supposed to be on the list.
But there was no way of sanitizing the list. Second, it arose out of the fact that some people were bent on doing mischief. And the coalition in the recount process came face to face with the mischief that had been perpetrated in all of the regions, and most of all in region number 4. And I would say the third reason is that our electoral laws have to be seriously re-examined.
Okay.
We live in a society, and I believe that we're mature enough as a nation to conduct elections on our own. I don't think there is need for foreign intervention. But the level of foreign influence in that period was phenomenal. I don't think we've ever seen it before. That you had ambassadors barging into meetings and getting involved in matters which normally diplomats wouldn't get involved in. So the commission was brought under relentless influence by foreign agencies. So the whole atmosphere was toxic, and after a while people lost the ability to discuss things freely and to reason, and we had to go to the courts. And as you see, sometimes the court ruled in favor of the arguments of the one side, and sometimes they didn't rule in favor of those arguments. But the matters went all the way up to the CCJ. And PNC is a legal party. PNC is committed to the Constitution, and all of our protests, all of our reactions were dealt with in a legal way, in a peaceful way, in a lawful way. And as I said, we hit a wall on the 2nd of August. But we have continued to assure our supporters, and we've continued to fight in the court to make sure that the elections, the results would always be credible and that the votes would be valid. It is a difficult task, but we have undertaken that burden, and I hope that some of the abuses that we saw in 2020 would not recur. But we've got to go beyond hope and ensure that mechanisms are put in place to prevent the type of mischief that was perpetrated on the people of Guyana last year.
So you actually went into my answering part of my final question. You would have mentioned the gap between the 153 days from March 2nd to August 2nd. You also mentioned just a few moments ago the involvement of the Caribbean community and the international observers. It was unusual. There was also the Black Friday scenario, which was on March 6th, the 6th of March, just to put a date to that. Sir, what was responsible, or what factors were responsible for the delay in issuing the declarations? And very quickly, what lessons can we learn or should be learned from the general and regional elections of 2020?
Let me go to the lessons first,
Okay.
because that is the more difficult. One, we have to look at the means of ensuring that the appointment of the chairman of the commission is not protracted, as Mr. 𝐏𝐤𝐜 tried to do
Okay.
in 2018, 2019. We also have to look at the appointment of the commission. Is it prudent for each major party to nominate exactly 3 commissioners? Isn't this a recipe for gridlock? And how do we appoint the commissioner after? As far as I'm concerned, although the courts disagreed with me, one court agreed, another court disagreed, that the person has to have experience as a judge. And as far as I'm concerned, the only 2 persons I've ever attempted to appoint were both judges, and there's no doubt about that. We also have to look at the sanitation of the list of voters. That there are too many dead persons on the list, and too many persons who should not be there. We have to look at the functions of the chief elections officer, which I believe are explicit. And he has to advise the chairman. He's the source of that. He's in charge of the machinery, the bureaucracy, and not the chairman. The chairman doesn't go out in the field and see what's happening at all of the polling stations. It is the chief elections officer. We have to deal with the question of validity of votes, and I believe that the ruling of our Court of Appeal was very strong. You cannot expect the CEO to rule or to accept invalid votes. We have to look at the various roles of the courts, particularly the CCJ. I'm of the view that in internal electoral matters, we need to strengthen the role of our own Court of Appeal. And my own interpretation before the CCJ's involvement is that the Court of Appeal was competent to rule on matters inside of electoral matters inside of Guyana. These are some of the issues that we have to deal with. In the final analysis, after the long period, I made it clear to my supporters that we had pursued a constitutional and a legal course of action. I agree with you that the Black Friday disturbances of 6th of March were a blemish on the election, in the entire process. The PPP had demonstrations in 𝐏𝐿𝐴, in Quarantine, West Berbice, and East Demerara, East Bank Demerara, and it was really a blemish on the reputation of our country. These were not PNC demonstrations, these were not APNU, AFC demonstrations, they were PPP demonstrations. And prominent persons who were now in the government were in those demonstrations. as you know what happened, school buses were stoned, children were injured. And I believe my own broadcast on the 2nd of August had a moderating effect by stating that we will pursue a legal course and a peaceful course. And I asked my supporters to abide by that request, and any further complaints or protests will be taken to the courts and will be held to the court to the law.
Sir, very quickly, what do you say to your support base now? The elections petitions was dismissed. You're currently preparing the appeal. What do you say to them now as they continue to support you and carry on their everyday lives?
Well, I can only iterate what I said on the 2nd of August, that there was massive mischief during the process on the 2nd of March, that we pursued a legal and constitutional path to the resolution of our complaints, which I feel are legitimate, and we have to leave it now to the courts. A country cannot be lawless, a country cannot operate without a constitution. I will not encourage my supporters to get involved in any form of lawlessness or public disorder. And I could just ask them to keep the peace and keep the faith. And I am confident that in the long term, the struggle for which they went to or the struggle in which they were engaged to ensure that the valid votes would be counted would be vindicated in the future. And I asked them to abide by that. I believe that we were right, and that the elections are called tomorrow, next week, next year, I believe the supporters of the APN UFC will continue to give their support to the party which stood up on the side of law and order and constitutionality and the validity of their votes, and would turn against the people who encourage mischief and disorder on the 2nd of March and 6th of March. That is my firm belief, that we did the right thing, we did the correct thing, and that the aspirations of the majority of the Guyanese people would eventually bear fruit.
Mr. Ghrein, thank you very much for being with us on this edition of the Public Interest. It's always a pleasure to have you, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And to your viewers, we say thank you once again for joining us. I'm Gabriella Patram. Do be safe.